Welcome to The Big Picture, a show that takes a deep dive into the political landscape of not only America, but right here in our own backyard of Illinois.
It's showtime, folks.
The Big Picture is on WCPT 820. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath.
Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you today from that big blue dot known as Chicago. Well, here we are. And to start with, I own up that was I wrong. And having been wrong about our chances in the election means I might also be wrong about its consequences. Boy, I hope so, but I doubt it. The things I said before the election, they aren't less true. From where I sit, American democracy may be the stuff of nostalgia by the time we celebrate our 250th birthday, in just 2 years. Mr. Trump and his gang want to remake America as Viktor Orban remade Hungary. They're clear about it. They talk about it. And Trump has powerful tools at his disposal and very few who will stand in the way. Listen, I'm going to read you what Mark Paletta, who is, after all, planning the Trump administration staffing of the Department of Justice, said this week. He said, the president has a duty to supervise the types of cases DOJ should focus on and can intervene to direct DOJ on specific cases. He is the duly elected chief executive, and he has every right to make sure the executive branch, including the DOJ, is implementing his agenda. His political agenda? That would be a huge break in our history. It would mean that all those promises of locking up people in the press, people in the opposing party, he could do it. He could try to do it at any rate. He could certainly make their lives miserable, as in the last administration, the last time he was president, he did with IRS, having audits of his enemies. This is massive abuse of power, and we should expect that and corruption at the highest levels. And look, all those GOP hearings about weaponization of government that we were put through for the last 4 years, they were just preparation for the actual weaponization that's now underway. Jim Jordan, he didn't have anything to find. He couldn't find anything, but he laid the groundwork for what it's going to be like now. Massively corrupt, massively political. And look, Trump plans to spend billions to create an internal system of prisons, ostensibly to house immigrants. But look, anybody else accidentally rounded up. You're not going to arrest 11 million or 15 million people and be very accurate about who you catch and all of that. But, oh my God, arrest 11 million people? It's not surprising that the private pension companies were among the biggest winners in the market this week. The stocks of Core Civic and the Geo Group both just had 5-day rises of close to 60%. 60% on the stock of those private prisons, because they expect to be building these internal jails for American prisoners. Meanwhile, Elon Musk will be tasked with cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget. That's basically the entire discretionary budget. Say goodbye to Medicare. Say goodbye to Social Security. Well, maybe not. And here's what I mean by that. Certainly the investors in the private prisons, they don't think we're going to stop spending government money. They think we're going to spend a boatload of it. And you know what? I suspect all the talk of spending cuts is just a ruse to gain corrupt control of the biggest pot of money imaginable. It is all about entrenching power. Trump's never cared about cutting the deficit. He's kind of using the money to gain power. Now, I don't want to get too in the weeds here in this opening with you guys this week, but here's the canary in the coal mine. I predict one of the first acts of the new Republican Congress will be the repeal of something called the Impoundment Control Act. That was enacted when Nixon was president to curb his overreach. And repealing the law will simply allow a president to refuse to spend the money that Congress appropriates. You remember when Trump was president last, he withheld money from Ukraine unless he could get an investigation into the Bidens? That wouldn't be illegal anymore. Like, this Congress will gleefully neuter itself so that it has the authority only to deny funding by not appropriating it in the first place, but absolutely no power to require it. None. Look, as a Chicagoan schooled in the politics of power, I know what this means. In the old days, if an alderman didn't sing to the mayor's tune, the garbage would pile up. But, city budget is nothing like the federal budget. Now, in the name of cutting waste, Musk can do the dirty work. Watch for infrastructure spending, billions, and disaster relief to shrink in states with pesky governors who don't toe the line. Instead of taking the heat for repealing labor laws they don't like, watch for them to decide not to spend the funds appropriated to enforce them. Oh, there are going to be thousands of examples. And of course, expect them to get rid of the IRS agents tasked with auditing the returns of the richest Americans. All of this hurts us badly. And corporate America, boy, they are just itching to get on board. And look, this happens in state governments that have been corrupt all the time. Corporate America sees political corruption as the cost of doing business, period. Never mind that it raises the price for everybody else. Never mind what it does to our social fabric or what it does to our country. Which brings me back to the mass internal arrests, expanded internal prisons, this promised new American gulag. It should be shocking and cruel to think about it. But you know what? It needs to be shocking and cruel for the Trump administration to use it to draw attention away from efforts to remake America as their dictatorship. And look, Americans didn't vote for any of that. They hired Trump because they're tired of working hard and not getting ahead. That's the real problem, and Trump was hired to fix it. And poll after poll makes it clear. Voters didn't like his position on abortion. They didn't think he really meant it. Voters aren't in favor of an American gulag. What we want, all of us, Trump voters and everybody else, is just a piece of America's economic success. I have one more lesson from Chicago that might be valuable. It would be enormously valuable to Trump. He's going to ignore it. But it could be valuable to the rest of us as well. Lori Lightfoot won 50 wards to become Chicago's mayor in 2019. I can't remember anybody ever winning all 50 wards to become mayor. It was an enormous achievement. 4 years later, she didn't even make the runoff. In between, she governed as if her large victory was something other than just a plea to get the job done. Yeah, Mr. Trump's going to make that mistake. It's going to be enormously damaging. And I know it's a lot to ask after all we've been through. So take a break, hug your kids, walk your dog, grieve, shake off the anger. It doesn't do you any good. Then let's get back to work, because if we pay attention, we might actually make our 250th birthday in 2 years a rebirth rather than a funeral. I have a great show for you today, a great show with fabulous guests. I'll introduce the first one right after this break.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I am thrilled to be joined by Tom Nichols. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He writes their absolutely fabulous daily newsletter. In his life, he has taught at the U.S. Navy War College for quarter of a century. He writes books that matter, including his 2023, I think, book, Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on American Democracy. Oops, that happened. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, on top of everything else, is it really true that you are an undefeated multiple winner in Jeopardy?
Yes, I was a 5-time undefeated champion back when they forced you to retire after 5. So
Okay.
I was in the 1994 Tournament of Champions, where honesty compels me to tell you that I got smoked immediately.
Well, I mean, yeah, so wow, that's very impressive. You got to be quick and have a very good sort of fast recall for that. You had to know a lot and be able to get to it.
Yeah, I was younger and quicker then. I don't know if I could pull up those answers so fast now after 30 years, but it was quite an experience, yeah.
Well, congratulations. Wow. And in your book, I want to talk, actually, I know it's not brand new, but before we're done, I have some things I want to talk to you about in your book. But let's start, because we have to start here. I personally think that Harris ran a fabulous campaign, and I think Trump didn't, which led me to the conclusion that for the first time I can recall, campaigns didn't matter a bit. Something else was going on. Is that right? What do you think?
Yeah, there was something else going on, but there were multiple something else's going on. The book that you referred to, I actually published it in 2021. And ahead of, it's actually important to point this out because I thought Trump was finally defeated and gone. But I wrote it to say, look, whether Trump is, defeated, and the last thing in the book was what happened on January 6th. I said, the electorate in the United States and other developed countries is changing. People are becoming more transactional. They basically just look at politicians as, give me this and I'll give you that. They don't care about character. They are bored, restless, narcissistic. I talk a lot in both of my last books about this epidemic, going back about 40 years now, of increasing narcissism among affluent societies in the West, including the United States and Europe and other places. But there were also other things going on. I think, a lot of folks who were hoping that Harris could win made the assumption, and I kind of fell into this, trying to be optimistic, that Trump was so awful, that the things he had done were so unforgivable that America would be ready to vote almost for any reasonable adult, any decent person who ran. But I think, it was a bridge too far to say that America was ready to elect a black woman. And, that doesn't make it right, but that was part of the equation. And I think the other thing that happened is people just got it into their heads that presidents control prices. And when the overhang from inflation, even though inflation's back down to almost 2%, people, when Trump gets out there and says, I'll just fix everything, we've become a society that doesn't really think much about stuff like that. We just say, you know what, I'm busy. This guy says he'll fix it. I don't care if he's a bad guy and he's done bad things. He'll fix it. I'm going to go back to watching TV.
Okay, so I want to take both of those points and talk to you more about them. The first one was that you thought that America just would think that Trump was too awful and unelectable, and they would have elected almost anybody else. I agree with that, but for this. I'm a huge fan of many of the things that Joe Biden did. But in retrospect hit me very, very hard. Whenever you're in charge of something, your biggest first job is to assess what are the biggest risks and to plan for those risks. And that's not what Joe did. He took on major issues in American economy that needed to be taken on, but he let the risk of Trumpism go. And I thought all along he should have treated Donald Trump the way FDR treated Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover was not a terrible guy like this. But we should have spent every day saying, I'm fixing Trump's COVID mess every day. I'm fixing Trump's economic mess every day. And I mean, if the president, and by the way, prosecuted him faster, and if they'd done that job, every day. I think your analysis would be completely correct. But instead, they normalized him. They let Trump make all of his liabilities into just politics, in which case they got discounted.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of institutions in American life normalized him. I especially agree that he should have been prosecuted faster, although what we learned from that, one guy that didn't normalize Trump was Jack Smith. God bless him. But, but what we found is that no matter what you did, there were going to be 6 justices on the Supreme Court said, this guy's never going to jail. You're not going to make him pay for what he did. And we've just decided that. We have spoken that Donald Trump is not going to pay a price. And, when you're up against that, you've got problems because you can prosecute him, but then you've waded into the swamp. But I agree with you that look, I think Joe Biden, in a way, gave into a very decent impulse to say Trump was a fluke. You've seen how bad he is. You know what he is. You've lived through January 6th. You saw how many people died during COVID because of his, chicanery about masks and, playing Americans off each other. Let's get back to being decent Americans and just move on from here. And I think, he didn't realize 2 things. One is that Trump's supporters are a cult of personality, that they were not going to let go. We obsess about the number of Republican votes that were flipped, right? That the Democratic Republican votes that were flipped. But the unflippable votes were millions of people who believe completely bonkers things and were never going to change their mind. And I think Biden may have hoped that group was smaller than it was. But the others, and Americans are really good at just forgetting stuff. It's just really frightening that I tweeted earlier this morning, somebody's talking about tariffs, and I said, I tried to have a conversation with a Trump supporter. I said, this is going to hurt you. You're a small business person. These tariffs will hurt you just like they did the last time. And this person said to me, what do you mean the last time? And I just thought, how did 7 or 8 years go by and suddenly all of this is just gone? And I think on that, I think there is reporting that suggests that the Harris team feels like they should have done more to remind people what it was like. But the problem was they made this decision that they're moving forward rather than backward. They're not looking back. But that, as you say, that kind of normalized Trump, and it let people forget what it was like when he was president.
Yeah, which is going to bring up a very big other topic, which is the America's media consumption habits, what's left of the so-called mainstream media, what they did and didn't do right. I think mostly not right. And I'm reminded that, where you work, The Atlantic showed up, as did, frankly, the New York Times and Horace Greeley and Joseph Pulitzer all showed up when the media before the Civil War got things wrong too and lost the trust of Americans. So I think we're it'll be very hard for mainstream media to win back trust, and they can't win it back by currying favor with the right wing because they're not really in the business of lying. They just weren't in the business of telling the truth.
Yeah, although let me add to your criticism, but then pull back a little bit of a defense here for some of the legacy media. And also, I'll just remind your listeners, The Atlantic was founded in 1857 as an abolitionist publication. So, The Atlantic's been banging the table for a long time. But I think a few things happened. One is that, yes, without doubt, mainstream media outlets gave into what we talked about. Our editor-in-chief did a piece on where we stand when he said this is the bias toward coherence. Jeffrey Goldberg talked about this, where it's like, it's so hard to watch Donald Trump and then say, I can't really sit down and write a piece that says the Republican candidate just had a completely, bizarre mental meltdown in front of an entire rally full of people. So you try to find something in it that looks like a political story, that looks like a coherent political position. And that, I think that was an understandable impulse by a media, by journalists who didn't want to seem to be taking sides, who didn't want to seem to be talking down to other Americans. But, Trump, at some point, and you saw this more toward the end when Trump just went completely off the rails, that, they finally started to report on it. But that lack of trust in the media is not, people who don't trust the New York Times are, I'm going to say, I think, the people that say I don't trust the New York Times, I remember those bumper stickers as a kid, by the way, during Nixon's administration, that in the early 70s, he was, I don't trust the New York Times. But the people that I knew that had those bumper stickers in my hometown didn't read the New York Times. They don't read the Washington Post. They hear about it from the media outlets that they pay attention to. So they hate the New York Times because that's what they hear from talk radio, from Fox, from, the other cable outlets. So they just say, well, the New York Times is the enemy of all that is right and good. The Washington Post is, this tool of big corporations. They don't actually read those outlets. So it's hard to rebuild trust with people whose going in assumption is that you're just corrupt. And I think that's part of this just division in America that's so hard to overcome.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's why I don't think they will ever get the trust of the MAGA crowd. But people like me who saw 4 years of headlines that said things like, oh, this month's job numbers are great. Can it last? Oh, inflation is coming down. Will it go? Won't. But what about next month? And we had that.
Here's why that's good news for Joe Biden.
The whole right, exactly. For 4 years, and then Donald Trump says, "I'm going to go visit labor union guys in Detroit," and they write, "Donald Trump's going to visit labor guys in Detroit." After all those lies they could have said, Donald Trump's going to visit. Donald Trump says he's going to go visit labor guys in Detroit. We'll see, right? But nope, didn't happen.
I wrote about this. I actually wrote a few pieces about this, and I said, because I'm a former Republican, and I joined the party back in the late 70s when, I was one of those moderate New England squishy Republicans. I wasn't a movement conservative. I was part of that distrusted Rockefeller wing, I guess. I was a working class kid in Massachusetts in the late 70s, and I wasn't going to vote for Jimmy Carter, and I wanted to feel optimistic about America. So, that kind of drove me crazy because I said what I saw happening is that Republicans for 35 years have worked the refs, that they have told the media over and over again, you're elitist, you're too liberal, you're biased, you're in favor of the Democrats, and on and on and on. And I think what you saw over the past 4 years was that somehow that criticism from the right, which was really I think in the 70s and the 80s, I think that was a reasonable criticism to make, that the media was leaning too far to the left. But they internalized that criticism to the point of obsession to say we have to be so fair that we're going to bend over backward for Donald Trump and never hesitate to criticize Joe Biden. And I think that's what you saw. And I think, that in its way is a form of bias. That's a form of bias that says we're terrified that we're going to be accused of being biased. Yeah. And I think it swung things in the other direction.
I agree. Yeah. I think, and for me, when the straw that broke the camel's back for me was the horrid story when the New York Times said, oh, here are the two housing policies. Kamala Harris is going to do things that you would normally see. And the New York, I can hear from your voice, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know the story. I just was like, how could this have, yes. I mean, to clear it up, in case your listeners don't remember, it was, Kamala Harris's approach is some regulatory reform and loans and givebacks and, tax cuts. And Donald Trump's is mass arrests of immigrants to clear up apartment space in big cities. And it was like, they were presented as if, well, these are just two plans. No. Yeah. One of them is a completely, fascist fantasy, and the other one's sort of a normal, wonky plan. And I wrote over and over again that it was a major error for anybody to think that this, and this kind of goes back to what you began with, that it was a major error for anybody to think that this was about policy.
Yeah.
People were not voting. No, most people couldn't explain Donald Trump's policies in a way that would hold water for more than 10 seconds.
Yep. And didn't care. Because really, they didn't care. They looked at their lives and they said, well, I think they said, look, inflation was hard. I mean, breakfast, it's hard to buy cereal. It just is. It's gotten beyond, expensive. $7, $8 for a box of grape nuts is not okay. And inflation touches everybody. Okay. Donald Trump says he's going to fix it. And Joe didn't defend his record very well.
No, although, the other, the other thing I found kind of unfair was for people saying, why won't Kamala Harris run away from Joe Biden's record? And, being a child of the 70s and the 80s, when you're at full employment and 2.5% inflation, I'm not sure what you're supposed to run away from. Because the structural problem for these people, for these voters, is they just had it in their head that the post-pandemic inflation is something Joe Biden created and he could fix.
Right.
And
utter nonsense.
That just isn't. That's not how it works.
Yep. But I mean, she could have said, "Look, I on his economic plan, I'm going to try and work harder to bring prices down," which she did say. But she could have said, from the beginning, I would have done more to warn people about the damage that Donald Trump did, remind him so that you don't forget, so you don't make that mistake again.
Right. And but that just looks like blame casting, unfortunately.
Yeah, because it was so late, right? Yeah. I remain an optimist. I do, but not because I think I am Pollyannish about the threat that Donald Trump and the people around him pose to civil society and to democracy. And I think it's bigger than any time in my life. But I'm an optimist because of some paradox, some very big paradox that is part of our lives. Trump's been given this gift, right? A very strong economy, inflation tamed, huge infrastructure projects on the way. I mean, he can take a little off the top, like he's going to, and still be a hero. But if he does what I think he intends to do, build this costly and cruel internal gulag system for immigrants and no doubt some political enemies that he rounds up in, of 11 million. You can't be that careful, right? If he raises everybody's costs with this dumb tariff plan, if he lets his allies do fetal personhood and end abortion everywhere, no propaganda machine, not even the powerful one they built or even the captured courts will be enough to hold us back. And that's a paradox, I think, and one that, I'm interested in your thoughts, but I don't think he's going to take the safe path.
Yeah, I think he'll try, and I think he'll be surrounded by largely incompetent and opportunistic people who won't have the sense not to try it. If that makes any sense, there used to be people who would say, no, you'd had John Kelly, for example, saying, no, we're not going to round up 11 million people because it literally can't be done. There are physical limitations to actually trying to do something that crazy. But you'll have people around Trump who say, sure, I don't know, why not? Give it a shot. And I suspect,
Stephen Miller.
That it will, and, it'll end in tears and recriminations. But you brought up something really important, Ed, which is that in January, Trump's going to start talking about the best economy America's ever seen because by dumb luck, he's going to inherit that from Joe Biden. And the problem is that works. This is something that has it drove me crazy when I was Republican, drives me crazy as an independent, that Americans think that presidents are Superman and they can simply change the economy at will. And he's going to play on that come January. So, people need to understand he's going to get a kind of honeymoon until the hot stove effect, kicks in. Because I think the one thing he can do that he can do easily with a stroke of a pen is he can start trade wars. And I also think, and I'm trying to be optimistic about this, but I really wonder what Americans are going to think when Putin really feels himself unconstrained and really starts ramping up the war in Europe. Because I think
he did this morning. Yeah,
exactly.
Already unprecedented drone attacks, killing civilians in Ukraine, starting today. Yeah,
and he's gonna start testing NATO, because this is his window. I mean, he's got 4 years now to prove that NATO can't function. And, there are enough. I mean, even without the United States, even if Trump, by law, he can't just pull out of NATO, but he can basically neuter our ability to participate in it. But there are 30 other countries in Europe, including some militarily capable powers, who may not take kindly to the Russians throwing their weight around, and bad things could happen. And I think Americans have, for 30 years, taken the supremacy of American economic and military power so much for granted that they haven't really thought about what could happen if that goes wrong. And that's the thing that, we can survive everything else. We can't survive the world plunging into war because Donald Trump, fired up some people at rallies.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you about this. Nearly every American, almost every American, there's some who are really old, but nearly every American lives in the world created from the ashes of the Second World War. And it's lived their whole lives that way. And that era, we've had wars in that era, but historically, let's call it what it is, the most peaceful and prosperous era in the history of mankind. And it's made possible, let's not be naive, my view, by American force and the deterrence it has had on enemies of that order and the reassurance it's given our friends. And I am afraid that era ended absolutely Tuesday. And we're returning. What are we returning into? And I love your thoughts on this, because my mind goes backwards, not forwards. It goes to an age of imperium. This is our sphere, this is your sphere, and then we get in huge fights about what those boundaries are. Is it the 9-dash line? Is it something else? And we end up at big wars.
I was thinking about this the other day as well, Ed, and I have to say, I feel privileged to have seen roughly the 15 years of the apex of American power and the culmination of the American century, basically between about 1985 and 2000. People forget how on the ropes the United States was in the 1970s. I mean, you and I are roughly the same age. We remember it. We remember talking about the Soviet Union was ascendant, America was losing the Cold War, NATO was going to dissolve. It was all over for us. And 10 years later, by 1985, that was a laughable proposition. I wanted to believe that what happened in 2016 was a blip, a fluke. But I agree with you. I think, we are living through the end of the American century. And what's really going to be interesting is to see Americans finally, the people that voted for Trump, having to contend with the reality that the goods and products and money and services and things that they rely on and that are so important to their standard of living will now happen at the behest of rules made in Beijing and Moscow. I think people just don't understand that once the United States is no longer the preeminent global power, that the kind of, like on a practical level, the kind of supply chain disruptions that happened during the pandemic, the Chinese could make happen just because they feel like it. Just to, rattle our cage, just to remind us to, watch our place. And people just don't understand how that works. Of course, Donald Trump loves these guys. He loves Xi and Putin and these strong men. He's not going to deal with that. I kind of grieve for that. I guess I feel like ever since 2016, I've had this terrible feeling about the decline of American power that Trump started us on. Biden, I think, did a brilliant job of holding NATO together, facing down the Russians, helping America reemerge out of that tough 4 years as an economic leader. But 4 more years of Trump, he's determined to do it. because that's the club he wants to belong to now in the world of, this fraternity of dictators. And I don't think the people who voted for Trump are really ready for what's about to happen to them. And I'm sorry to say that, but as I say, I feel the way you do. I kind of grieve the end of that period of American greatness.
Yeah, and I don't blame Trump's voters. I don't think they're stupid. I don't think that's what they want. I think they are excused for not foreseeing this consequence, in part because of the failures of the press that we talked about before, in part because of the transformational and dangerously transformational social media world that has broken it's largely filled with propaganda, and it's broken our ability to tell a narrative of American greatness.
I'm going to blame some of them. I think that's a little too forgiving. I don't think we get anywhere by infantilizing millions of people and saying, well, they really don't understand what they're doing. In 2016, I had a lot of friends and colleagues even who voted for Trump in a way that you could kind of understand. They said, listen, I cannot pull that lever for Hillary Clinton. I've never seen what Trump can do. I think a lot of this is an act. He'll bring in good people with him. There were a lot of stories you could tell yourself. Trying to tell yourself any of that in 2024 is just a lie. It just really requires you not to be so detached. I suppose the few voters you could really be more forgiving of, I guess, to put it in your terms, are the people who literally have been just checked out completely and who have no idea what's going on at all. But then, then we have a different problem, which is a completely uninformed sector of the electorate has no idea what's going on. I mean, the founders would be appalled at all of this.
Yeah, they would. I mean, I think there is that uninformed sector for sure. But I mean, I'm thinking about the Americans who voted against abortion bans in their states and voted for Trump. They voted in referenda to maybe raise the minimum wage, and they voted for Trump. They don't want what he says he's going to do. They say, I don't believe him when he says it. I'm mad at the Democrats and Biden for what happened. And if it's a binary choice, I'm mad at them. I'm going to throw these guys out.
Okay, but again, and I understand. I've seen this before, right? I worked in politics in Massachusetts, and then I worked in national politics. But I can remember having conversations back in Massachusetts with voters, and remember back then, I was a Reagan voter, and I'd have conversations with guys who voted for Ted Kennedy and Ronald Reagan at the same time.
Right.
And I'm like, What are you thinking? I understand you voting for Ted Kennedy, or I understand you voting for Ronald Reagan. What I don't understand, and what you found, is it was very transactional. Well, Ted gave my kid a summer job, and he's got to bring a highway project. But I like the way Reagan talks, and he's tough, and I think he's fun, And I mean, really, this is not a healthy thing. And with Trump, again, I think in 2016, you could make these arguments. In 2024, to say, well, I'm just mad about inflation and I'm going to punish Joe Biden and Kamala Harris by electing Trump, that's a much more understandable position if you've never seen what Trump does. And I think the strangest thing that comes out of some of the exit polls, and I know that there's been reporting that the Harris campaign has been looking at this, is somehow people just said, all that terrible stuff that happened when Trump was president, it's just not his fault. And I think that's a really worrisome thing, because that's Trump's message, right? Yep. I take no responsibility. It wasn't my fault.
Anything.
Well, for
credit
anything.
For everything, blame for nothing.
We elect presidents to be responsible, and when you have millions of people saying, Joe Biden is totally responsible for what happened up till yesterday, and Donald Trump has no responsibility for anything that happened for 4 years. Again, I think you really are in a kind of entertainment space, and I think this goes back to your point about, the right-wing media ecosystem, which treated Donald Trump like an ongoing TV show.
Yep. Like it's all a wrestling match. That's not really important, but who's your favorite
people
guy?
renewed him for another 4 years. They thought this was a fun show. The Biden show is boring. It had bad ads, and so they're going to go back to the other one because that's going to be more interesting.
Well, you and I, think politics and governing is important, really important. And I mean, I guess, thank God, most of the country doesn't have to pay attention to it like we do. They pay attention to other things, but they should pay some attention. They should. Hey, can I ask you some questions about the book in our,
Sure.
Our Own Worst Enemy? In it,
sure.
I think, if I read it right, you said that illiberalism is basically our fault. And I think it's worth taking a minute to understand what you mean by illiberalism and sort of how we brought ourselves to this terrible place. Because forgive me, I know it's radio and I shouldn't do this. You sound like Book 8 of Plato's Republic.
Well, I did I did get my graduate degree at Georgetown, and I did have to study that book with the Jesuits. But I think it's a simpler point, and it's a global issue. I mean, illiberalism is a global movement right now of people, and what I mean by illiberalism is people using the levers of democracy to vote for people who are going to take away their democracy. It's basically like, saying, I'm an American and I have rights, and I'm going to vote for the guy that's going to take away my rights because that will punish other people too. I want to vote for somebody who's going to make us all suffer because at least that way I won't suffer alone.
Got it. So the liberalism is not an economic liberalism. It's a political one.
It's political illiberalism, exactly. It's not has nothing to do with economics. It's people basically saying, I feel like other people are living better than I am, that I am looked down upon. I am resentful of the way they live. I think resentment is the driving force of global politics now. And where does it come from? It's not actually because there are many people who are poor and many people who are rich, even though that's true. The illiberal movement is not the very poorest against the very richest. What you find with Trump voters, just as you did with Brexit voters and illiberal voters in Italy and Poland and Turkey and other places, is that these are actually middle-class voters. Most of them are reasonably comfortable. If you look at the January 6th rioters, these were not unemployed factory workers. These were chiropractors and retired cops and real estate agents. And I think we lost some of the warnings of history from people like Eric Hoffer, for example, who in 1951 wrote about mass authoritarian movements. And he said, look, one of the most dangerous signs for society is the presence of mass unrelieved boredom. And a loss of values. I think the thing that Trump presaged for us in 2016, and you could already see it starting to happen in the 90s, is that once the Cold War was over, once living standards became very high, once technology began to really gin up an incredible standard of living that, that even within my lifetime I could not have imagined 40 years ago, people became entitled, they became bored, they became resentful, and that puts every democratic government on a treadmill, that it will exhaust it. Because democracy, liberal democracy, that is the one that is tolerant of other people, that is secular. I know people don't want to hear that, but the First Amendment, we are a secular country, secular, tolerant, cooperative, trusting. All of that is that's not based on the law. That's based on moral qualities within us. And if we abandon those, there's no form of government that will work. I point out in the book, James Madison, when he was arguing for the ratification of the Constitution, people in Virginia said, well, what about checks and balances? And what if we have a president who's a bad guy? And what if Congress is whatever? And Madison said, look, we have to be a virtuous people who elect virtuous people. He said, if there is no virtue among us, then we are in a terrible state.
Yeah.
And he basically said, if we're not good people, none of this works. And the problem is that affluence, rising expectations, entitlement, very high living standards. And again, this is among the working and middle class, not the very poorest. The very poorest actually vote in favor of democracy because they think government's going to protect them because they're powerless.
Yep.
It's the middle class that says, I don't think I'm being respected as much as I should. I'm a 58-year-old guy, and I don't like that, my barista with all her nose rings seems to have more social respect than I get. And it really is it's a very kind of petty, resentful approach to politics that I think in part, and then I'll get off my soapbox here, Ed, but in part I think this explains why it's so difficult to talk to Trump voters, because they become so incoherent so fast. They're just generally mad about the way the world looks. And when you try and pin them down about, well, are you suffering? Not really. Yes, cereal's expensive, but I'm doing okay. Well, is this barista camped out on your lawn? No, I live in an area that I like. Is crime affecting you personally? No, but I hear it's terrible in San Francisco. There's always some excuse for feeling the rage that they feel. And again, those right-wing media outlets seize on this. And they say, yes, the whole world is criminals and immigrants and trans people and whatever to keep them in this constant state of agitation.
Yeah, I think they seize on this I would say they cede to this. They certainly are one of the big causes of this angst. I think that's fascinating, and it brings us sort of to the last thing I want to talk to you about, which is like, I think politics is enormously important, but it is a child of civil society, and I think that's what you're saying. So I want to understand, so the 50-year-old guy is feeling disrespected because the barista gets more respect, and he lashes out. You're completely right on that, but I think the 50-year-old guy gets less respect than the barista as a function of something in our civil society, and maybe we have a lot of work to do so that everybody feels a little more respected and feels like they have an actual contribution to make, because then they might actually respect their own ability.
Except that, it's amazing to me that people, I had this argument with a friend that I grew up with, a working class guy with a high school diploma, had a house, 2 kids through college, a boat, and he sat in my living room talking about how much the country had screwed him over. And, as I said to some of the folks that I've known that long, look, you were brought up better than this. This is wrong. Your parents wouldn't have sat here and said, wow, this country really hosed you. And, because as I said, when did this occur to you? When you were on your boat?
But what did he mean by screwed over?
Well, after pushing him hard enough, he just doesn't like the fact that our neighborhood is, that the local barbershop became a Spanish storefront church, that, that it's not full of kids from the baby boom anymore, that the lumber mill closed down, even though none of us would have wanted to work there.
Right.
We had a lumber yard, right, like walking distance from our homes, but it wasn't, nobody's big ambition was to go work in the smokestacks and the lumber yards, but the notion was, well, somebody should have, because that's how I remember my childhood. And I said, you don't even live in our town anymore. You don't live in the same place. But I think it's just this kind of, it's almost like a big, generationally, at least for those guys, it's almost like this huge midlife crisis where they're just mad about everything.
Yeah.
And you simply cannot reason them out of it.
So change is hard for people. Social change is very hard. Technological change can be very hard. And we are in the midst of rapid and accelerating change in almost every possible field. I mean, and never in history has we've seen as much change as we're seeing. And I think there's no place in the world where change happens as fast as it happens here. So how do we resurrect a set of values that we say we can hold to through this time of change? And because you're right, we're being buffeted every which way, and people are just raising their middle finger and saying, you know what, stop it. But the change isn't going to stop. So,
well, as I've said to many, again, these are not just voters; these are friends. I've said, and I said this in 2016. I said, okay, you've won the presidency. He's got both houses of Congress. You win. What do you want? And there's this kind of moment of stunned, groping, because what they want is for it to be 1967 again.
I hope that's not right, because then they really will get those gulags.
Well, and one of the things that I think is really, and I talked about this in the book, and thank you again for asking about the book. This is also among younger people, false nostalgia. I cannot tell you how many times at 63 years old, I've had somebody who's 25 or 30 say, well, but back in 1970, 1980, you guys had it great.
I've heard the same thing. And I say, you got to be kidding.
You don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Live without your phone for a day. It wasn't hard to move back then because, we didn't have much. Maybe a record player if we were lucky and 4 records. Right.
Well, you could afford
good luck.
You could afford a home. A family of 4 could afford a home on the father's paycheck. Yes, and that home was a 1-bedroom, 3-room walk-up. Where 2 kids and their parents all, lived in the same room. When my undergraduates would say this to me, I would ask them to raise their hands about a few things. I'd say, how many of you know what an oxygen tent is? And I'm wondering how many people even listening to us now know what an oxygen tent is. That if you had a heart attack or any kind of trauma or that they literally took a big plastic tent and latched it down over your bed and pumped oxygen into it and hoped that you could breathe. And by the way, while that oxygen tent was going, there were people in the hallway smoking cigarettes.
I do the same thing with my students, only I use a card catalog in a college. I show a picture of a card catalog. It's like, what is that?
Right. Exactly. Or a 19-inch television with rabbit ears, or a car. One of my friends made a great observation. He said, one of the worst things that happen to working people is that it's very hard for them to use the excuse that their car broke down, because in the 21st century, even the crappiest cars actually run pretty well. Yeah. They don't break down, and I think that, when they talk about 1970, or kids who say, well, college was a lot cheaper in 1980 when, 79 when you started. And I'm like, because nobody went. Because only 14% of women in this country had a college degree. That's why. And they just kind of look at me, and I basically. And you
wouldn't live in the dorm they would have put you in. That cinder block little box.
Exactly.
With 4 other people.
And the other thing too is to say, this backlash against inflation and economic conditions, what people are voting for are 2020 living standards at 1970 prices. Yeah. And that's not going to happen.
I got to interrupt you only because we've run out of time. And this was 45 minutes. It went by like that. So you have to come back. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So have I.
Yep. All right. Everybody, that was Tom Nichols. Please, he publishes this daily newsletter at The Atlantic. You got to read it. And then if you do, you'll start reading the rest of his stuff because it's fabulous. All right. We're going to take a break for the news. And then when we come back, I have to talk to Jeremy Young, because we need to talk about censorship.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. A little after 2 o'clock here in the upper Midwest. And I'm joined now by Amanda Marcotte, who is the senior writer at Salon. She has been thinking, like so many have, about what happened Tuesday. And in particular, she wrote this fabulous piece that talked about the phenomenon of voting for Trump while also voting for progressive politics, part of this weird paradox we talked about earlier. Amanda, welcome. Oops. Can you hear me? There you are.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for your work, which is terrific. Hey, before we get to the analysis that you did, this election was hard, and the results were not what we expected, and our side needs to grieve and work through, I don't know, anger and hurt. And we don't have much time because the work ahead is very real and daunting. How are you handling this shocking transition, and do you have counsel for people?
I think I'm doing a lot better than a lot of people I know, and I think the reason why is, as a journalist, I have things I can do. I was at Howard University for Harris's watch party, and I just went right back to my hotel and got to work. And I think that being able to do something to just work and whether effective or not, hopefully effective, but start, writing, working, doing work that can hopefully push us in the right direction bit by bit is a great comfort. And so I would recommend to people who are feeling bereft, there's nothing like taking action, any kind of action. It doesn't necessarily have to be electoral. I think that doing activist work in your own community can often make you feel better. There's a lot of research that shows that helping other people and doing volunteer work and things like that can be a tremendous help for your psychology. It may make you feel less helpless because you're actually doing things.
Yep. And I guess, for gosh sakes, don't sit alone. Join others. The society that we need to build requires us to talk to each other. Yeah.
I mean, I was in D.C. for the election, and then I came back home to Philadelphia. And I feel like being in these communities throughout this period has been really helpful for me psychologically, because it's just everyone here, they're commiserating with strangers. They are comforting each other. They're holding each other up, and it's nice that people are trying to make sure that others don't feel alone.
Yeah, really important. And I think that's partly because we built something remarkable in a very short period of time at the end of this campaign. And if we can make it last, it may protect us a little bit from what's to come.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a real community out there, and a lot of work that needs to be done. So I think that, it's scary. It's scary knowing that Trump has designs to stop us from doing the work that we want to do. But I think people should persevere anyway.
Yep. Well, let's persevere and talk about this piece that you wrote in Salon about the millions who voted for Trump while also voting, to overturn his abortion bans. What do you think is going on?
Well, I mean, I think it really just comes down to something that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about, which is that a huge number of voters in the U.S. are just profoundly ignorant. And it's gotten way worse than it used to be because, I think that not that people have always ever been super well versed on information. That's not how most people are. Following all the ins and outs of politics is something that only junkies have ever done. But the stuff people believe is is completely, like, the amount of delusions, the amount of conspiracy theories, the amount of just false information sloshing around out there is completely out of control. And we have a lot of data that shows that most Americans, increasing numbers of Americans, don't read newspapers. They don't even watch, like, the nightly news. They maybe will read a news website, but often what they're reading is not like a real news website, but like some fake nonsense, like Breitbart or something. And then by and large, they're getting their information from social media, where which not only is just completely awash in misinformation, but the algorithms, it has been shown time and time again, the algorithms are designed to feed people like radicalizing material that is false, is emotionally driven, is about playing on your fears, and again, false. And you know, this is not new information, but the fact of the matter is, we have all these discussions after this election. Most of the discussion I've been seeing is, what did the Democrats' messaging get wrong? Is there a way to tweak their messaging? And I'm like, what tweak to the messaging would work when the vast majority of people that you're trying to reach with the messaging are too busy looking at Facebook memes about cat-eating Haitians or something? Like, it's a very difficult situation, and I know it scares people because it's like, it's hard to know what the solutions are, but until we address the real problems, we can't even start.
Well, no, you and I are starting. The vast propaganda machine there's never been a more powerful one, and social media and the algorithms behind it are feeding confirmation bias very aggressively and taking people that way to places that they wouldn't have recognized if their past self were told to look at their present self, right? Because you affirm in some way everybody's expectations until you've brought them to a vastly different way of looking at the world. And that's where we are. We have to find a way to communicate with our fellow citizens. I mean, reality often does this. And I guess that's why when you ask them a simple question, should abortions be banned, they say no. But when you ask them a more complicated question about, does Donald Trump really responsible for banning abortions? They're not sure. He doesn't really.
Yeah, huge numbers of Americans are unaware that Donald Trump is the reason that Roe versus Wade got overturned. In fact, surveys showed us, I don't remember what, but it was like a solid 10 to 20% chunk think Biden did it.
Right, because that's what they were told by pink slime media and other folks. I mean, the amount of lies is huge. I think as president, Biden could have done more to talk about the politics. He chose instead to focus on an economic agenda and doing things that long-term, I think are very good for the country, but he took his eye off the political risk and let this stuff get normalized.
Yeah, I think part of it is it's like there are real legal issues that we're facing, and it's frustrating because they didn't move to ban TikTok until very late in Biden's presidency, and now that might get derailed because Trump wants people on TikTok. And the reason he wants people on TikTok is because he knows that TikTok is probably the single best feeder of disinformation to people, and especially young people, and keeping people ignorant, keeping them afraid, keeping them focused on conspiracy theories and racist myths and stuff like that is how he keeps power. So he's going to want people on TikTok because TikTok, I don't have a TikTok account, but a lot of people I know who started one, they were like, it's shocking how it doesn't take very long before you're just getting fed just the wildest and craziest, nuttiest right-wing propaganda.
It is,
and it's frustrating.
Yep. So when you said there were legal challenges, was that what you were talking about, or were you talking about things in the courts?
Well, I think there's a few legal challenges to dealing with our social media problem. The first is that, there's the obvious First Amendment issues, like attempts to control social media, to regulate it in any way, are going to run up against claims that their free speech is being assailed. And unfortunately, we now have like a very conservative court system that is willing to take a very expansive approach to defining free speech as long as the speakers are right-wing propagandists. And what I mean by that is sorry?
I'm saying, forgive me, I don't think it's a conservative court. I think it's a corrupt and captured court.
Fair. But I mean, for instance, you could pass a law that doesn't say ban them from publishing what they want, but it does say that they can't use algorithms that radicalize people, right? You could just ban the algorithm. You're not banning the speech on the platform. But this Supreme Court is just not going to let that happen, even though that strikes me as a very normal regulation.
No, Citizens United was the same idea. Citizens United said, Amanda, you have a free speech right, but Edwin can come set up the biggest amplified speakers in the world all around you because he has the money to do it, and he can speak at the same time. And your free speech rights aren't harmed if no one can hear you because he's drowned you out. That's just what we think free speech is. When they said money is speech and corporations are people, that's what they said. And so they're not about to tell the algorithm it can't bury somebody's speech with some other lie.
Yeah, I mean, and they do. We know that they do. It's not even subtle. There's been many, many experiments run that show that, for instance, if you're on TikTok and you start engaging videos that are about home cooking, it's not about 100 videos later on home cooking, you are down this deep rabbit hole of trad wife content that's all about right-wing conspiracy theories and joining a militia. I mean, it's completely nuts. It's very hard, I think, for people that are on it to understand how much it's falling down the rabbit hole when people get into it, and that how many people are on these platforms.
So how do we again, so much of what we have to do is not political but social. It has to do with American society. How do we treat social media addiction like we treated the fentanyl addiction problem, or any other one that came before it?
I think the first step is people need to recognize that the owners of social media companies are not their friends. I think one of the biggest issues right now, one of the things that drives a lot of people to social media and away from mainstream media is, again, after decades of right-wing propagandists telling them not to trust the mainstream media, they now think journalists have an agenda. But they don't stop to consider that the Chinese government has an agenda, and they basically run TikTok. They don't stop to consider that Elon Musk has an agenda, and he runs Twitter. They don't stop to consider that these billionaires who own these social media platforms have an agenda. They have every reason to be shoving right-wing propaganda at you. And I think part of it is that people, because it's called social media, people are under the assumption that what they're seeing is user-generated, and therefore it's it feels more authentic to them. And in one sense, that's true. It is user-generated, but what they're not understanding is that the people behind the scenes that you don't see are manipulating the videos, the posts, the content that you're seeing. They're making sure that the nuttiest people generating content on the platform are the ones that are going to be in front of your eyeballs.
Yes, they're generating content that their research shows you will click on and you will stay on and you'll be curious about and you'll click something else. And they lead you step by step by step into peril.
Yeah, and a lot of the time that content is stuff that's really shocking, right? That's one of the reasons that lies do better on social media than the truth is that lies are usually pretty spectacular. Like, the truth is Haitians live in Springfield, Ohio because there's jobs there and they were asked to move there to do those jobs. That truth is very boring. Haitians are stealing cats and dogs and eating them. Now that's a nutty thing to say. That grabs your attention. That people are going to focus on that because that's some wild accusation. The problem is that, and that's just true over and over and over again. Lies are just more exciting than the truth. Like, the truth is usually pretty boring.
Well, okay. So, again, the people who have fallen down this rabbit hole, they're not less smart than I am. They just have that's why I view it as an addiction. I don't think the majority of Americans who, no one on my side is saying, oh, the election was rigged. That's a disease on the other side. But the majority of Americans who voted for Donald Trump, I don't think they're stupid. I think they're victims, in a way, of an enormous propaganda machine. That doesn't absolve them entirely of responsibility for the coming maelstrom, but I think we have to figure out how to help them get unhooked from this poisonous IV. Part of it is like to read your stuff. There's plenty of good journalism out there. We just can't find a way to, I guess, absent an enormous crisis, find a way to get people to wake up.
Yeah, it's a real sticky widget. It's clear from one of the things that is really uncomfortable about this is that there is good evidence that one of the reasons that we're seeing an education gap open up really strongly between the parties is that, to a certain extent, education does help people have a little bit better protection against the tricks of the trade with propagandists, right? It's just they teach you that stuff in college, a little more critical thinking skills, and you practice it, and so you might be a little less gullible to that stuff. And that makes everyone uncomfortable because I do think people can confuse that with saying that someone's less intelligent. And that's not true at all. It's just some people have resources that other people don't have to help protect them against this. And, I also think working class professionals who are on their computer, they're accessing the internet that way, they're probably seeing less of this stuff. People that go on the internet through their phones more than their computers see more of this stuff. There's all these weird little structural things that are making this worse for certain people.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go someplace, and if you think it's inappropriate or uncomfortable, just stop me. I have daughters, and earlier this week, when I saw "Your Body, My Choice" memes floating around, I was so angry and so upset. And I think it relates to the conversation we were just having about social media, but I fear it's related to the prevalence of pornography everywhere as well, too. And I just wonder if you've seen that, if that's something that you've thought about, not the pornography part, the Your Body, My Choice horror show that's out there.
Yeah, I did see that. And it's actually a really good example of how, even without Elon Musk's thumb on the scale, and it's very clear, there's been research that shows he's putting his thumb on the scale, But even prior to that, like Twitter was good at amplifying right-wing propaganda for exactly that reason, which is like that the person who tweeted at Nick Fuentes, he's a professional troll. He's a neo-Nazi professional troll, and he said that because he knew that a lot of people would get mad about it, and they would start arguing about it, and they would retweet it and denounce him and stuff. And like all of that, the algorithm just reads as engagement. And so the tweet just gets more and more popular, and it just gets put in more and more people's feeds. It spreads really far and it's being spread, sadly, by some of the people who hate it. And that's part of the structural problem that we're facing.
Very, very good point. Amanda, I left Twitter. I sort of needed to look at it until Election Day, but then right after I'm done, it's gone. I don't, and I don't know how, I mean, useful tool still, but I don't know how anybody who values the truth and our democracy justifies helping Mr. Musk and keeping that network alive, because as you point out, it serves to spread utterly vile stuff.
Yeah, I really wish more people would quit Twitter. I mean, I haven't yet and it's a real tragedy of the commons problem, right? Which is,
yes, it is.
Like, I can't quit Twitter because if I do, a lot of my readers who won't quit Twitter, I'm going to lose them, and I can't lose them.
Blue Sky is growing rapidly. Yep.
Yeah, and but a lot of people won't make the jump because they're professionals who need social media to hawk their wares, as it were, and just giving up that audience. If users' lives if we all held hands and jumped, it would be fine.
Yeah, I had an audience on Twitter. I gave it up. I couldn't. I couldn't justify it in this world anymore.
No, and I've reduced mine drastically, but I think that it just shows that this is a collective action problem, and it shows the limits of sort of the individualistic approach to taking action in these situations. We must
do it together. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Hey, Amanda, before we run out of time, why don't you tell everybody how to find your writing and how to find you on social media that's not repulsive?
So don't go to Twitter, please. I am on Blue Sky. I am on Threads. I have a newsletter at salon.com/newsletter. It's called Standing Room Only, and I write every day at salon.com.
So I urge everyone who's listening to find a new media environment. Salon is fabulous. The conversation we had just before Amanda came on with Tom Nichols, The Atlantic, is fabulous. There are wonderful, later on we're going to talk to Michael Tomasky at the New Republic, fabulous. There are plenty of ways to get your news honestly and without the vitriol and the vile and the, should I stay with the V's? What else? The invective. Amanda, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday to join us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. We'll talk again. Take care.
Bye.
All right, everybody. Again, you can find Amanda at Salon, and I hope you will. We'll take a break. We're going to come back. And then, as I said before, I'm going to talk to Jeremy Young because we have a lot to talk about related to books.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
You know, guys, in my last show right before the election, I told you I was grateful to you for the community that you created and what we were going to do to try and win, even though we didn't win. I'm grateful to you for another reason. It's given me a chance to talk with people on this show over the years who've later become my friends, my, workers in this fight that we share together. And one of the guys who's been on regularly, who didn't know before, now he's a friend and he's fabulous, is Jeremy Young, who directs the Freedom to Learn program at Penn America. And as you know, Penn is the foremost free speech, anti-censorship organization, maybe in the world. And boy, does he have a steep hill to climb. Jeremy, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Edwin. Always good to be on the show.
Okay, I'm not even sure where to start. Look, the election took place in a time when Americans were mad about inflation, upset about the border, where Democrats delivered maybe powerful economic solutions that will benefit people sometime in the future, but where Democrats, we also failed to make the case against rising authoritarianism, choosing instead to focus on maybe advancing social ideas that the majority considers, I don't know, at best, a distraction from the real work that government should do. If that frame is right, then we missed an opportunity to talk about the social ideas that the majority does consider important. For example, the idea that books shouldn't be banned.
Yeah, I don't know whether it really is responsible for anything to do with the election, but I do think that, the idea of banning books, the idea of censoring higher education, all the stuff we work on at Penn America, these are deeply unpopular concepts. And I think that our elected officials have been overly cautious in their willingness to raise that as a talking point. Banning books is wrong. This is something that some people want to do. Trying to bring that into the electoral system, I think that's a really important argument to be making, and I don't think we've been making it effectively over the last few years.
And it's a winning argument. I mean, you've done polling on this. People don't want books banned.
They really don't. I still remember the poll that I saw that showed that 64% of rural Tennesseans opposed any book bans for any reason. This was back in 2022. The numbers have not gotten better. Of all of the censorship ideas, book banning is the least popular. Some of the restrictions on higher ed also deeply unpopular. We don't know if these are so unpopular that they move votes, but they certainly have in school board races where book banning candidates have been roundly defeated in many places around the country, including in Florida, in many parts of the state. So, I think this is a winning message, and I think it's something that needs to be hammered, a lot more than it is.
What's the status? How many books are now banned? What does the lay of the land look like?
So we put out a new report on this earlier, just a couple of weeks ago, and what we found is that over 10,000 books were banned in school libraries in the 2023 to 2024 school year. Now, that is an enormous number. That's more than twice as many as were banned in the previous year, and there's a reason for that, and that reason is laws passed in several states, especially Florida and Iowa, which resulted in making it much easier to ban books in districts, to ban them statewide in school libraries, and that have just resulted in massive numbers, thousands of bans in each of those states, as well as several other states. So, it is sort of opening the floodgates for book bans on a scope and scale that has never been seen before in this country.
Yeah, they haven't had a public book burning yet, but it's just a matter of time. Jeremy, let's talk about higher ed for a minute. I mean, do the election results? Do you think we are looking at the imposition of state-sponsored curricula in higher ed? I mean, how bad can it be? Is it possible that the 1776 project will come back? Do you foresee federal funding becoming contingent on teaching those lies?
I'm not sure that is in the cards, but there's certainly a lot of things that are in the cards federally. I mean, we are on day one. I expect there to be a cutoff of all federal grant funding that requires diversity components in universities. I think that the diversity components will be stripped out of things like NSF grants. I think there will be certainly efforts to remove diversity language from every part of the federal Department of Education, every regulation, every approach to that work. And I do think that there's some interest in some more draconian solutions like conditioning federal funding or accreditation on getting rid of diversity in the curriculum at schools, at medical schools, even attempting to go after the accreditation system itself. The only thing that's going to constrain this administration is anything that requires court approval, which could still be a limitation, or anything that requires an act of Congress to change a rule, which would be subject to a filibuster. But we're going to see a lot of awful things coming toward higher ed federally, and at the state level. Our report that came out last month indicated that there has been an escalation, even at the state level, of legislation coming, is through sort of stealthy mechanisms, attempts to disguise it as other things like viewpoint diversity, even when it's really trying to ban tenure or faculty governance or diversity work. And also an escalation in just bullying and threats, jawboning against university leaders by lawmakers at the state level. I expect those state lawmakers to now feel emboldened, unleashed by what just happened in this election, and for that problem to get dramatically worse.
Can you give me some examples so that people can sort of see it?
Yeah, a good example of this in Wisconsin, the legislature in Wisconsin in 2023 passed a ban on DEI offices in the University of Wisconsin system, which was vetoed by the state's Democratic governor. They didn't have the votes to override the veto in the legislature. And so instead, the legislature simply said they were going to withhold all state funding for the university system until the university leaders, quote, voluntarily banned those DEI positions. They held out for 6 months, and then, facing basically having to lay off large numbers of staff, having to deny everyone a cost of living raise, the universities capitulated. We've seen that kind of capitulation to lawmakers threatening to pass DEI bans in places like North Carolina, in Kentucky, where a DEI ban was defeated. University leaders were then threatened by lawmakers who said it would come back even worse next year, and many of them have gone ahead and dismantled their DEI programs as well. And a story that we're about to comment on next week at the University of North Texas, university leaders are going way beyond anything that's in the law or even contemplated as being in the law, editing curricula, rejecting syllabi, even canceling some courses just because of fear of what those lawmakers are going to do to them if they don't do it. So that's really what we're seeing at the state level, really horrifying stuff, and I expect it to get dramatically worse.
Talk about North Texas a little bit more. So these are school administrators who aren't hostile, they are just afraid?
As best we can tell, that's the case. The school administrators are afraid that they are going to have their funding cut or that some of their programs are going to be de-accredited by the state if they don't not only close their DEI office, which they've already done in compliance with the law, but also, restrict courses from even mentioning diversity work, restricted in research, restricted all across the board. Things that are explicit carve-outs even in the law. The law itself may be unconstitutional, but even the law doesn't go as far as what the university leaders are doing. So we're going to have a statement out on this next week condemning them.
So the initial target of diversity work, they're going to go after, and they will be successful, I think. As you say, they already have been, either by blackmailing organizations, but they control the purse, and they will dismantle efforts at even thinking about diversity. Okay, so what replaces that? A meritocracy or something else? What is their thinking about? If we can't talk about diversity, what are we supposed to talk? How are we supposed to think about how we all get along and how we come together, create communities.
You know, these lawmakers and thinkers, they will argue that diversity is self-divisive, as perverse as that is, because it is what is separating us into different groups and different identities and making people think about themselves as some identity other than American, right? So that they're argue that we just shouldn't think about race, shouldn't think about gender or talk about them, and then we'll all sort of identify as being part of the same culture and the same society. Well, what they're really going to bring about in banning various concepts on college campuses is a sort of climate of fear where university leaders are beholden and university professors and even students are really unable to express publicly viewpoints that the state government or the federal government does not agree with. They think that they are creating a sort of equality where we just don't talk about these divisive concepts, as they call them. But in reality, they are enacting the official government censorship of ideas, and that is going to that's what I fear most in 2025.
I don't know how you talk about, if you're in an economics class and you want to talk about wages in the United States, how you can do that without talking about gender because of the disparities. I don't know if you're talking about a history class and you want to talk about the causes of the Civil War, if you can do that without mentioning the fact that, gee whiz, those folks who were enslaved turned out all to be black.
Well, and then we just get back to those old lost cause ideas that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery; it was about states' rights. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we are going to see promoted in the next few years. Is just the idea that you can't have the leading scholars in the field determine what is taught in these college classrooms, or the universities as a community through shared governance determine what is said and what ideas are promoted on campus. Instead, you're simply going to have state actors, government actors, politicians making those viewpoint determinations for them.
I don't know if I've ever told you this story. In the 1990s, before WTO, or mid-90s, I was in China doing some work with a university. And at some point, the president of the university, who couldn't have been nicer, said, "You have to leave the room now." And he said, "I'm being called back. The party needs to clarify some things that they heard. And then we'll be back and tell you what you're allowed to talk about next." Like, I'm sorry. So I didn't go back and talk next. But that's sort of this notion that some government purity test is going to be enforced on ideas in higher ed is the stuff of the Chinese Communist Party when it was really focused on ideological purity.
Yeah, I think you've got that exactly right. And, we are really going to see now whether these unpopular ideas whose proponents have nevertheless been elected to govern the country are going to drag those leaders down. I think there is a real opportunity here, actually, for those who do support democracy and do support the free expression of ideas on campuses, to really, as you said at the outset, to really promote just how unpopular and how censorial and how suppressive these ideas are. I mean, one of the theories that is circulating, I don't think we're going to know for a long time what happened in this election or why it happened, but one of the theories that's circulating is that, there is a sort of backlash against cancel culture or the intolerant left. Well, let's talk about the intolerance of officially suppressing ideas on a college campus. I mean, that is something that we need to be hammering, I think, for the next 4 years, really until it stops.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I actually am more worried. I am not more worried. I am worried equally that they won't just suppress ideas. They will favor a set of ideas. And at the end of the last time Trump was president, they pushed this thing called the 1776 Project, which was a description of American history that was simply patently dishonest. And and they were trying to push it into curricula then. I am terrified that they're going to push it back now.
Well, and that's even been happening at the state level already in K-12 with the Hillsdale charter schools and things like that. But yeah, I think they're certainly going to ramp up their efforts federally. I think they're going to try to promote all sorts of ideas that just aren't supported by evidence, that just aren't supported by the scholarship of the leading minds in the field, and really just don't understand the way that scholarship works and that ideas circulate in higher education. It's not just promoting things that agree with you on any side of the ledger. There is a peer review process. There is an evidence process. There is an effort, or there should be an effort, to try to figure out what's really true. And I think, we're going to have the movement of misinformation and disinformation of this type dramatically into higher education. I do think that's going to happen. It is going to be promoted by the government.
Your answer reminded me of something that I just have to keep repeating all the time, which is that Americans want to make this about the right does this and the left does that. They tell their lies, we tell our lies. They have their Supreme Court justices, we have our Supreme Court justices. You're either liberal or you're conservative. But what you're arguing for is neither. You're arguing for a process that has been vetted over time, proven itself efficacious to discover truth and to share truth. And it's one of the reasons why our society's done so well, because we have this process. It's the same thing as saying, you know what, if you let me pick all 9 Supreme Court justices, I wouldn't pick left-leaning Alitos ever, not one, because I'd pick people who actually care about the law and care about the process of judicial thinking. It's a very different thing than it's just your side and our side.
That's exactly right. And I think, the person who put this best of all people was John Stossel, who was doing an interview a couple of years ago with Chris Rufo, one of the architects of this regime of censorship. And Stossel, of course, is a libertarian, and he was really pushing Rufo. And what he said was, nobody has a monopoly on the truth. And if you try to require that universities promote a particular set of ideas that are conservative or liberal or whatever, you are, instead of following the process by which we determine what ideas make sense and are supported by evidence, you are instead trying to assert an official monopoly on the truth within universities. And that is the problem. And I completely agree with him. That is something that we have to fight against with everything we have got.
Jeremy, I'm very interested in that conversation. I assume Rufo said, oh, no, I have a monopoly on the truth, because that's how he thinks.
That is basically what he said. He said, the goal of higher ed is to promote the true, the good, and the beautiful, the old Plato phrase, yep. and basically intuited that he knows the answer to what those things should be, and Stossel just wasn't buying it. It was a very interesting conversation.
Plato has come up frequently since the election. I can't tell you how many conversations have begun with, well, Plato didn't like democracy, and he said it would collapse. And here you're bringing him up again in a different context. In this context, though, for those of you who don't read Plato, he was not doctrinaire about the truth. He was the most curious guy in the world. And you read his dialogues, and they delight in, this may be true, but then there's this other thing that could be true. And they spend a lot of time on it. And the shortest one might be this dinner party that they have to talk about what love is. And you can just read it. It's absolutely clear. He's not pretending a monopoly on the truth. Sorry about that, Jeremy. I'm defending my old scholar here.
That's quite all right.
So what are we supposed to do faced with this enormous power that's now been vested in people who believe they have a monopoly on the truth, whether that is the true faith, the true course of education, the true nature of leadership and politics, that all of it, which smells authoritarian to me. But what are we supposed to do?
I have taken heart in the last couple of days by this quote from Jesse Eisinger, who is a senior editor at ProPublica and was addressing the newsroom earlier this week in the aftermath of the election. And he said to his fellow journalists, now we face the biggest test of our professional lives. Now we get to see if we really meant it when we said we will hold power to account. Will we do so when our subjects have true power on their side and a willingness to use it? We may be harassed, we may be sued, we may be threatened with violence, we may be ignored. Are we just sunshine journalists, or are we ready? And that really encapsulates my approach to this situation. I mean, I think that it's not just for journalists, it's for anyone who wants to fight for democracy, for freedom of thought, for freedom of ideas. We have got to be ready. We have got to fight now harder than ever when it matters the most. What does that look like in a practical sense? It means we do not allow these ideas to rest. We are going to see a lot of really bad things coming out of this administration related to higher education, related to the free expression of ideas. We should be pointing out every single one of them. If you're a citizen, you write letters to the editor, write op-eds, talk to your lawmakers, talk to your federal lawmakers, make noise about this. If you are in a position where you are representing higher education in some significant way, as a university leader, as an association head, we have got to build something that we have not had for the last 4 years of this. We have got to build a massive, organized, coordinated movement to respond to these threats. Higher ed needs to stop being a pushover and a soft target for these kind of attacks. We do not have a mechanism for higher ed to defend itself against attacks that come at the state level, attacks that are ideological, attacks that are based on the whole sector and trying to undermine all of what higher education stands for. We have to bring people together, and we have to have a strategy and a plan, and we have to implement that plan, and we have to fight. So that's my take.
That's a very good take. I have two thoughts about it. One is that there's an additional and special burden on private higher ed because their colleagues in the public system are truly threatened by the power of the state purse. But they're in the same boat. So the private ones who can afford to take a little more risk must lead here on behalf of all of their colleagues. And then, Jeremy, I don't expect this fight to be without victims. I think we will have, as every really difficult fight does, martyrs in our cause. And I think we have to be ready to celebrate them, not to forget them. And I'm even talking about folks sent to jail or folks who got pushed out of their fields. I don't know how bad it'll get, but it will be bad enough so that we will be able to identify people whose careers have been ruined, if not their liberty taken. And we cannot forget them.
I completely agree that this is going to be devastating for a lot of people, and we have to remember those people and lift up those faces and voices. And really, the people who are going to be, if history is our guide, the people who are going to be most dramatically impacted by this are going to be, people of color, scholars, diversity officers, people who are working in institutions that are not Harvard, that are not Yale, that are community colleges, that are regional comprehensive universities, that are small privates with struggling finances. Those are the places we're going to see the real impacts here, and we have to keep an eye on the human cost of these attacks. That's the other thing I would say. There is people like Chris Rufo, they love to talk about, this idea was banned or restricted. Colleges and higher education are made up of people, humans, whose lives, whose ideas, whose identities are wrapped up in this institution that helps so many people and creates social mobility and innovation and all of that, the good things we value about higher ed. That all comes down to people. It all comes down to communities. And we have to talk about those people and those communities and put them front and center so that we make sure that we are really focusing attention on what it needs and taking it away from the ridiculous ideas we see bandied about higher education lately.
It is a huge fight, and I know because you and I have talked about this. Higher education is a remarkably different set of cats to get marching in the same direction. Part of what makes them great is that they're filled with brilliant individuals who are brave enough to research things that are not always popular. but that makes them politically naive.
Yeah, I think they are politically naive, and I think that there is a risk of trying to keep your head down if you're a higher ed institution or part of the higher ed sector, because you're afraid that, what might be coming, and not recognizing that this is the moment when everyone has to stand up. This is just this is a world historical moment right now for higher education. This entire system is in grave danger. It is DEFCON 5. We cannot sit on the sidelines any longer. We must get and pull together, and we must fight. And that's what I'm going to be promoting around the country as I talk to these groups, Edwin.
That is fabulous, Jeremy. I look forward to supporting that work, and I'm thrilled that you're doing it. All right, tell people how they can find you, find the work, support it if they want.
Well, I would, a couple of links I'll give you. Our website at PEN America is pen.org, pen.org. If you want to read our most recent report on educational censorship in the 2024 state legislative sessions, that's pen.org/ACC24. pen.org/ACC24. And if you would like to join PEN and support our work directly, we need all the support we can get. That's pen.org/membership. pen.org/membership.
It is a fabulous organization. And if you like to read, you will love this organization. It celebrates the writers, really, everywhere. And, hence why thought is so important. All right, Jeremy, as always, it's great to catch up. And I can't tell you how important your work is and how much I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Edwin. The fight continues.
You bet. All right, everybody, we'll take a quick break for the news. And when we come back, Michael Tomasky and the New Republic to round out our show today.
Edwin Eisendrath is taking your calls now at 773-763-9278. The Big Picture is on now. WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. Some combination of, post-election trauma and live radio is conspired to get our signals crossed. So I don't have Michael Tomasky right now. So let's just go right to your calls because there is so much to talk about. So 773-763-9278. Henry is on the board, and he will let me know that you're calling. Just, give Henry your name, and he'll tell me, and we'll get right to it. I want to say, while you're calling in, that you should go to the New Republic. The magazine has just a really terrifying look at what they call American fascism will look like. And I think anybody who just thinks, it was another normal election and everything's going to be just normal, that's possible. Again, you heard me say at the beginning, it's possible. And I hope that's what happens. I hope that the terrible things that were promised, both in Project 2025 and in the GOP platform and by Trump himself, turn out not to be the things they actually want to do. And there's a lot of reason for him not to do it. I mean, saying these terrible things helped them get elected, but they've inherited a great opportunity because the economy is solid, very solid. And all these jobs are coming online because of the infrastructure stuff that got passed, and inflation is down. It could be a lovely couple of years. And if I were counseling them, I would say, take credit for it, enjoy it. And, if you have to grift a little off the top, grift a little off the top. But let it go. But I fear their worst instincts, and I fear the people that are filling this administration want to weaponize the Justice Department, want to control what's taught in our schools, in higher ed in particular, want to build this terrible internal gulag system to deport so many Americans. And what that will do to our society, I can't even begin to imagine. And I even think no matter what Mr. Trump says, his the Leonard Leos of the world are going to have a fetal personhood case before the Supreme Court, and they may just declare that fetuses have 14th Amendment protections, and that would make abortion and all kinds of other health care illegal immediately in 50 states. This is my fear, and I am preparing for the resistance, and I'm preparing for what it takes to remind us of our better selves and be ready for this fight. All right, let's start the calls. Gino, you're first.
Hi, Edwin. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to bounce a few ideas off you. I respect your judgment a lot. You had mentioned earlier with one of your guests that you thought something was going on during this election. So I'd like to kind of unpack one of the things that could have happened. When we hold an election, there's the turnout and who turns out. And then the second piece of it is the vote counting. So women have been casting more ballots than men since Reagan's second term. So do you know of, between Reagan's second term and this election that we just had, do you know of any elections where the Republicans captured a majority of the female vote?
I think all of them. I mean, really, certainly white women have voted Republican in every election. Maybe Hillary got a majority of the female vote, which I think she did. But women, I mean, maybe Barack did in one of his elections, but women have voted. I mean, women certainly voted for Trump in large numbers.
Okay, but does that make sense? Especially after Roe v. Wade.
The thing that I want, that I believe, is that we are an enormously complicated species, we human beings, and we do things. Every one of us does things that we don't even understand why we're doing them every day. I mean, and if we think we understand, then you ask the people you love why they think you did it, and they got a completely different reason, right? We're complicated, and this is a complicated time, and there's so much in our information world that is impossible to square. Lies and not lies, accusations and defense, and people are complicated, so you have Trump voters who at the same time go to the ballot and vote to say, no, we will not have an abortion ban in our state. I don't know. Again, people are complicated.
But does that really make sense? I mean, I can see how a minority of people would vote against their own interests, but now we're requiring a majority to do that.
Gino, I'm too old to think to ask if what somebody does makes sense. They're their own actors. They're responsible for their own decisions. They made them, and there'll be consequences for them. And we will have to deal with those consequences, defend against the worst of them, and live to fight another day, hopefully. That's where we are.
Well,
I don't want to get anybody. I'm not a psychiatrist.
Okay. Well, one other point then I would like to make is the electronic vote counting. Have you read some of Greg Palast's book, How Trump Stole 2020?
I did not.
Okay. I would recommend that you read it, because one of the points he brought up in his book was the DRE, the direct recording of ballots.
Yeah. Yep.
So on those machines, for whatever reason, the manufacturers have made it possible for you to turn off the audit trail. Palast found in Ohio in their elections that they have turned that off. So that's a bit odd, I would think, that you would want to turn off how you could audit the vote counting. And the second thing that's odd is if you were manufacturing something to count votes, why would you even set it up so that you could turn off the auditing?
I don't know. I haven't read it. I promise I will think about that and look at it. Generally speaking, I have confidence that our votes are fair, that the person with the most votes, that we actually count them and we count them fairly. Anyway, Gino, I got a long list of people, so I'm going to move on. I don't think we've talked before, so thank you for calling and thank you for being part of this conversation.
You're welcome.
You bet. Steve, you're next.
Yes, I want to make a couple of points, and it was great that you had Tom Nichols on. If you ever get him on again, please get him to talk about his earlier work, The Death of Expertise. It's something I've been talking about for a long time.
Yep. Thank you.
I mean, we're not here absent that reality in terms of where people are getting their information from. I mean, as Tom has said on a number of occasions, about 30 years ago, we got it into our heads that, oh, well, I'm just going to go out and do my own research, as if everyone is qualified to do such a thing. There's a reason why we build universities and, have credentials for all sorts of things, because not everyone is qualified to do these things. And you talked about Plato. I mean, this reminds me of the allegory of the cave. I mean, that's who these people are. We're spending hours of their lives on social media looking at that wall, because that's the equivalent of that wall, is this perverse notion of reality.
I'm sorry. I'm not laughing at you. I am laughing because the allegory of the cave came up in a conversation I had this morning. That the entire country is revisiting Plato in this moment, and I find it fascinating.
Well, and you know what? I wish that were a lot more true than what it is, but I firmly believe that only a few percentage.
That's right.
People,
but it's being written. That's
what we're talking about.
Let me just, while we're on the topic of Plato, Steve, recommend that you go look at Book 9 of the Republic. It's after the discussion of the cave. It's after the discussion of why democracies fall, but it talks about the nature of the tyrant that's going to arise. And you can read this in Book 9, and you're going to go, oh my God, how did Plato know Donald Trump personally? It's an amazing thing.
I mean, it goes to illustrate that over 2,000 years ago that somebody knew human nature. And that, guess what? We haven't changed all that much. Our institutions may have changed, technology has changed, but the way in which we think, hasn't. And the fact is that people embrace a strong man, and they just put aside. I've had these debates both before and after the election with people, these discussions about why in heaven's name would you want to swap out a system that's working so well? Tell me what's so bad about the economy. The economy is in great shape. But, it's just this thing with that has been dubbed the vibeflation. In other words, a vibe session.
Let me ask you this question. I ask you this, and it's related to the questions that are asked in the Republic. Donald Trump proved many things in this campaign, but one of the most obvious that he's proven his whole life is that he is incapable of governing himself. His appetites, his greed, his thumbs on Twitter. He cannot govern himself. And the question is, when you have someone who can't govern himself, how is it you would trust him to govern the rest of us?
Oh, that's an excellent point. And I would argue that Donald Trump, one, is an unstable human being to begin with. And now he's an unstable human being who's in mental decline because of his age. He's a fundamentally flawed individual who's not very intellectually curious. I mean, I'm reminded, you just had that discussion about Western liberal democracy, and I'm reminded of the press conference in Europe where Donald Trump was asked that question by a reporter there. Like, what are your opinions about the decline of Western liberal democracy? Donald Trump responded by alluding to Nancy Pelosi, as if we were talking about that kind of liberal. He doesn't understand these things in the conceptual sense. And it's frightening that you could have a president who doesn't understand what that reporter was asking about.
Well, that's where we are, Steve. All right. Well, I'm glad that you have not, walked away from this fight and that you're ready for this next round. The next round is going to be a boat in much rougher waters. So we need to look out after each other.
they've got about a year, and then they need to start running for the midterms. So, it's going to be a rough year. But beyond that, I have a lot of faith that, we can unmask exactly who they elected. But, again, Americans made this choice. Now we have to live with it.
We did. All right. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Stephanie, you're next.
Hi. It's my first time calling, but I do enjoy your show.
Thank you so much. And Stephanie, where are you calling from?
I live in Pembroke, Illinois, which is in the township in Kankakee County, Illinois. I
know very well. Very well.
Well, used to be, Hopkins Park used to be predominantly black. That's how it started. Yep. With 32% Latino now.
Yep.
Now, that's not the problem. The problem is we have some, and this is what I was bringing up, the arrogance. We have a lot of them saying that Donald Trump will not hurt me because I am actually, even though I'm Latina, I'm white Latina. And that he's not going after the white Latinas. He's going after those other, brown rapists and murderers. So
you know what? He's going after every American. He's going. If we build a prison system to deport 11 million people, oh my God! I mean, first off, can you imagine what our society would be like with internal camps housing hundreds of thousands of people at a time, and to find them knocking on doors at night, saying, "Show me your papers," and pulling people away? He's not safe. No one is safe.
Well, we almost had a FEMA camp down here, and I went to my Latino friends, and we fought it because our mayor decided that he wanted to put you should heard them talking about, this is not a FEMA camp. They're going to have tennis courts and they can play soccer. It's going to be like a dorm. It made me want to go. I'm like, no, it's a FEMA camp. Okay? Yep. And so, but the problem we're having is that we have a bunch of land. We have the largest dunes in the Midwest here. And some of the people coming from as far away as Waukegan and Michigan come down here to ride their four-wheelers on private land. And when they're told they can't, they say, why not? This is the best dunes. But it's all private. So people put up barriers, and they bring equipment down and tear down the barriers. And then when you talk to them and say, this is private land, they say, so what? This is what we want to do. So and the ones that are saying that, they're very arrogant. And they're saying, somebody mentioned one time, y'all better watch out if Donald Trump gets to be president. And that's when they said, us white Latinas, don't worry.
Well, history is not on their side. And you know what?
I know.
But even if somebody gave them a get out of jail free card, right? The empathy that we all have to have for each other should make everyone worry, right?
Yeah, and that's what I told them. I said, I worry. You might be white Latina, but your grandmother may not have taken the right route up here, like you claim your parents did.
Yeah.
I care about her. I care about her being taken, or your uncle, or your nieces, or your nephews snatched from their parents simply because they're immigrants who are not quite legal, or whose legal status he wants to take away because he can. I told him, I care about all of you all because you're American citizens, and just the fact that you're human.
Yeah, I mean, look, we all know we need a border that is secure. We need a border where people who want to come here go through a legal process. You can't have an out-of-control border. That has been, like, everybody now agrees on that. Maybe everybody didn't, but now everybody agrees on that. And we even have a bill that was bipartisan and negotiated. Trump didn't want it, but now I think it'll pass, right? And he'll be happy to sign it now. And that will help a lot on these issues. But that's a whole lot different than throwing people out or rounding up 11 million people. Oh, my God.
If he does pass that bill, he's going to take the blame if the crossings, go down. I mean, no, he's going to take the credit for the bill he refused to sign for a year.
Of course he is. He's going to take credit for. Trust me that on January 20th, he's going to say, The Dow Jones has reached all new levels because I'm president. The economy is great because everybody knew I was going to win. He's going to try and erase Joe Biden. And we have to just hold on. We're on a rough seas here. We're going to have a spigot of lies like we have never had, and graft and corruption like, even Chicago aldermen blush.
But
anyway, Stephanie.
I'm going to let you go. But I'm proud of
Thank you so much for calling.
Yeah, our governor said he's not going to let Trump do anything in this state.
Yep. Good for JB. I agree. Hey, thank you, Stephanie, for calling, and thank you for being part of this conversation.
All right.
Jim, you're next.
Hi, Edwin. What a difference a day makes. I think that's Sarah Vaughan. But
yes.
Australia's about 50 years ahead of us as usual. They're banning social media till you're 16 years old, which is a fine thing because they didn't want mincemeat made out of the poor kids' heads before they even get to high school. But anyway, look at the miscreants in our social media affair here. I mean, was it Charlie Kirk? He won the election single-handedly. But anyway, let's talk about the Project 2025. All right. All the degenerate policies by the Democratic Party, I'll admit, Social Security, Medicare, HUD housing, the 8-hour work week, the Affordable Care Act, are all degenerate policies. According
apparently.
to the... Well, that's the way we voted. That's the way we voted. Those are degenerate policies, and they have to be replaced by, what do you think it is? You think they're going back to the Federalist Party in 1798? What is this? What do you think? What do you think they're? In other words, when they Hillsdale College and PragerU, and you see these commercials that they have the interpretation of the Constitution, they have the interpretation of the Bible, they have the interpretation of whatever literature we're reading. And we've been led astray by this degenerate Democratic Party. Okay, I'll admit that. But one thing I will not do, and I can't predict my behavior in this, if I see an out-of-control police department or people being hassled, immigrants being hassled, I can't tell you what spontaneously I'm going to do or how I'm going to react to it, Edwin. I have no idea because I can promise you this, as God is my witness, I have never seen anyone in my 74 years on this earth mistreated, not in my presence, man, woman, dog, beast, or anything else. And I continue to be that way. I don't know how we're going to get out of this. I have no way we're going to get out of this. But think of the criminals. What if you got Steve Bannon with a ready standing army of the Proud Boys and etc. And not only that, but you want to start it already. I saw people with red shirts on. Believe this or not, the manager of one of the stores I go to. He said, Jimmy, you're not going to believe this, but his butcher, somebody mentioned Trump's name. The woman went to the counter and said, you've got somebody talking about Trump. I want the manager. And he happened to be the manager. So he came up to the woman. He goes, what do you want me? You want to sue me? Here's my card. I mean, this is how belligerent and ungracious these people are. Why they fell in love with this molester? This guy's a molesting genius. And not only that, when they do put him on Mount Rushmore, and they do build his library with his wife's books, the number one bestseller in the country, if you can believe that. I mean, there's more books about Trump than anything. All of them are the same. They all have the same theme. He's insane, a criminal, and we know he's an extraordinary criminal. We know that because he can't be prosecuted.
Yeah,
but the rest
Jim,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was having trouble hearing you for a second, but let me just go back to your first point. I had the very good fortune to have the chance to talk to Martha Minow, whose father, Newt Minow, was a Chicago legend, and Martha was for many years the dean of Harvard Law School. And yesterday I had the chance to ask her about Australia, the very thing you raised with social media. And she said, you know what? They don't have a First Amendment. We can't do that in the United States. Montana tried. We don't have a legal framework.
Well, we're doomed. We're doomed. We're doomed. We're just doomed. That's all it's doing. Because the art of conversation is dead, Edwin, whether you know it or not. The social intercourse of conversation is dead. Nobody on this earth that I run into has any idea of what they feel or how they feel. I talked to voters. They said, I saw video. I saw the immigrants that were kidnapping people on the street. They're kidnapping people. I mean, that's serious. They're dead serious. Say... No, but I mean, we're dead. We're finished with that. I mean, it's going to be the death of us.
I hope you're wrong. I recognize
there's nothing to be wrong about it. It's the truth. It's just the absolute truth. And we're so consumerist. But Edwin, we're such consumers. Adam Smith did it in the beginning of the 18th century. He made consumers out of people. He made consumers out of the Irish because they had a reliable. The people that stole their land and hustled their land, they needed to be their taxes paid on time, and they had to be reliable consumers. And that's exactly what we are here, reliable consumers. Anyway, good luck with this. This is torture. I can't look at this guy for 4 years. I can't look at it for 4 years. Maybe you can, but I can't. Anyway, take care.
Hang in there, Jim. All right. We're going to go to Brian in New Mexico.
Hey, good afternoon.
Hi there.
You hear me, right?
I can, and I can't. You sound a little gravelly, but that may be my phone. I can't tell.
Okay,
Henry, how do we all sound?
Everybody sounds pretty good.
All right, then let's keep going.
I'll proceed. I wanted to make the observation that Trump is in the White House because of the poor condition and shape of the two main political parties. Both our parties are very, very off track and not functioning. We don't look at political failures that have occurred over the last several decades. The deregulation of Wall Street, our engagement with China, the handling of the pandemic, on and on and on. And I'd like to hear you comment, and then I'd like to respond. You heard Bernie Sanders comment about what do you expect if the Democratic Party abandons America's working class? Do you think he's off base?
Hey, Brian, I'm going to do something unusual because I really am having trouble hearing. Let's take a quick commercial break. Brian, you stay on the phone. Don't go anywhere.
Okay.
And during the break, I'm going to log out and log back in and see if that helps, okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Edwin Eisendrath is taking your calls now at 773-763-9278. The Big Picture is on now. WCPT 820.
All right, Brian, you were giving me a theory about both parties being broken, and that's how we ended up here.
Yes, very weak. We have a criminal psychopath headed for the White House because he had hijacked the Republican Party. And then the Democrats couldn't figure out a way to beat him. And, Bernie Sanders is right when he said that what do you expect if the Democratic Party abandons America's working class? And they have. And ever since Bill Clinton and the neoliberal trading immigration regime got put in place, it's been a disaster. The engagement with China has been a failure. Now, look what we're doing now. We allowed American manufacturing to offshore. Now we got to bribe high-tech manufacturers to bring their chip plants back to the United States because we figured out that, we need those chips for our military stuff, and we can't have the Chinese making them. And this is all predicted. I got into union labor in the mid-'80s, and I remember Bill Clinton being elected. I remember these discussions and NAFTA and all of it. And it's been a disaster. Bill Clinton was terrible. He was wrong on so many important questions. The Telecom Act of 1996. And that's why so many working class Democrats are mad. And they're mad at the Republicans as well. And the issue of the day is immigration, and the Democrats are wrong on that. Stop playing identity politics Because look, Hispanic males are heavy Republicans now. How'd that turn out?
I think you're onto something, and I think both parties, the Democrats belatedly, and they signed on to this unbelievably tough immigration bill, and they will support it when Donald Trump brings it back up and signs it. So I think the immigration question, the chaos on the border is not acceptable for any Democrats anymore. I mean, may have got there late, but they got there. And I actually think there's a revisiting. I mean, it began belatedly, it began only in the Biden administration, but a revisiting of this neocon idea that was the dominant idea in politics. Both parties, I think it started with Reagan. It got confirmed with Clinton for sure. And then it became the dominant ideology of both parties until Biden. It's not clear what will come, because it's not clear that Trump will. I don't know what it will do. Actually, I have no idea what his economic thinking is. I just don't, and I don't know. I don't think he does, or as an articulate.
Just another comment.
You're right.
Trump.
You're
Trump
right.
won the popular vote.
He did, absolutely. And he won it for the reasons that you state, I think, which is that Americans, they just want to share in the prosperity that we all work to create. And since 1980, that hasn't happened. From 1945 to 1980, as the economy grew, so did the standard of living for everybody who lives here. And from 1980 on, that hasn't been the case. As the economy grew, the rich got fabulously wealthy. And that is not how we build a society together. So you could not be more correct on that score.
And then another observation: Congress, the Article I branch, is completely dysfunctional and has been for decades. They haven't passed a regular budget since when? It's been years.
Well, I want to say I mostly agree with you there, but I think Nancy Pelosi managed to pass remarkable big legislation. The infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science Act, the ACA. They did manage to get a lot of stuff done. But the thing that has corrupted Congress more than anything was the Supreme Court's appalling and horrible Citizens United decision, which said unlimited amounts of dark money can pour into our politics. And now our congressmen spend their time on the phone raising gobs of cash, or having, organizations they don't even know paying for their elections and then calling on them after.
Right.
We are
and the majority of Americans can't even tell you who their congressman is.
Yeah.
And then the next election 2 years from now, we'll have a much lower turnout because people aren't paying attention. The billionaires pay attention because they know they're going to get the tax bill. See, that's the issue. Yeah. Who's going to pay the bill? And billionaires pay attention because they have the money, and all they hear the Democrats talk about is how the rich people are going to pay for everything. So they pay attention.
Yeah,
right?
They're paying attention. Hey, Brian, thank you for calling. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being part of this conversation. David, you're next.
Okay, so I want to start a political action committee to convince you that you should run for alderman, if not mayor. We're going to call it Draft Eisendrath. You like that title?
I did that once before. I have been an alderman. It was a long time ago when I was young enough to do the job.
I know. I remember you as the young gun who was out there speaking the truth. And, you're a person of integrity. Now, one thing that troubled me a little bit, I want to talk about education in Chicago because it worries me. And I got Chicago friends that are all ready to say you should run. But anyway, when you said, did you say that people in Chicago should just take this in and do the grift?
No. What?
You said grift?
About what?
Later on, you said, about 20 minutes ago, before I called in, you said something about we're going to deal with this and just take it for what it is, and if you can take a little grift on the side.
No. Here's what I said. The economy that Donald Trump is inheriting is going to be good. It's going to really be good. And inflation has been brought down. And there's going to be all these new jobs from the infrastructure bill. If Donald Trump could just ride his great economy, and since he's going to be a thief, he could just take a little off the top for himself, I think the country would be fine if that's all it is.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think that
right.
That's what I meant. But I don't think he's going to do that.
Right,
I think he's going to, yeah.
I understand. So, but here's why I think you should run. Now, you talked about some really good things that were happening in Chicago public schools, and I got to say, not every kid can go to Walter Payton or to Kenwood Academy or Brother Rice or go to Whitney Young. But, when you look at the schools, the really great high schools in Chicago, some of them have less than 100 students, and that the reading rate, proficiency for high school seniors is like 10%, and for math, it's even less than that overall. And then Chicago spends $30,000 per pupil. That's why I want someone like you to get back in the race, and I mean that big quote-unquote race, get in there and clean things up and make sure that these Chicago public school students graduate with some sort of skill set in a very, very competitive economy.
I appreciate that. I thank you for your confidence. We have a lot of issues in Chicago. I mean, this is mostly a national show, but just let me take a minute. Chicago has it has to grow again. Dallas is about to be a bigger city than Chicago. And so just to focus on my national question, if cities like Chicago become less important in America and cities like Dallas become more important in America, right-wing politics becomes more important. And a city like Chicago that is still got some working class values, they become less important for America. So we have to grow. And we have to grow because we can't afford the things that our city government is doing. Right?
Edwin, how about this? I think that you were onto something, but I think you maybe misspoke, if I may possibly say so, is that not Dallas, but Houston. I would argue that Houston is already bigger than Chicago. Since the 30s, Chicago was 3.3, 3.2, 3.3, 3.1 million people. And then as of 1995, it's gone down and down. And it appears that at this point, we might be down to 2.6 million people.
I agree with you.
600,000 people.
I agree with you. I think Houston is bigger than us, and Dallas will be. Is my point. We are going the wrong direction. Yes,
Edwin,
we are losing people.
The exodus.
Well, I appreciate that. But I know Houston has caught us. I think Dallas is next, and if you look at the trends, they're growing. We're not. And can you imagine two cities in Texas bigger than Chicago? It's just
if we grow, then Chicago
jobs come.
The biggest city in the world.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, in 1933, Chicago was one of the biggest cities in the world, and always maintained a population. Didn't really grow, didn't really shrink, but again, 3.2, 3.1, 3.3, and then in 1995, the Great Decline. And so what? 1.5 million people have left Illinois. 600,000 people or more have left Chicago. The taxpayers, the students that would fill those schools, the people that would be working, that we don't have a manufacturing base. You go up and down Ravenswood, and there's all those manufacturing companies. You can just walk in and get a job, and they're gone.
Well, look, I love talking about Chicago, but again, my focus on the show is a little bit more national. But I appreciate your confidence. I love my city, and I think we can do so much better. Thank you so much.
You're going to allow me to copyright draft their Eisendrath, get that copyrighted?
Sure.
All right. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care. I think, Nikki, you're next.
Hi, this is Vicki. Thank you for taking my call.
Of course. Thank you for calling.
Oh, thank you. Hey, I just wanted to make a couple of observations. First, I was really disappointed in the outcome. But the silver lining for me is that I don't have to watch Vice President Harris age prematurely go gray, trying to work with a Republican-controlled Senate and House, so she could not get her agenda passed, number one. They would not have confirmed any of her nominees. And psychologically, they're so nasty, calling her an unintelligent DEI hire, a whore. I mean, it hurt my feelings. And so I just don't want her to see her go through that. I don't think she would have been set up for success, and she's still a young woman. So that was a silver lining for me. The other thing is that oh, I'm sorry.
No, the humanity is so important that we don't lose it, And we're faced with guys who, as a political strategy, have checked their humanity at the door and are saying appalling, thuggish things. I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think most people cringe at that, but there were other issues at play during the election. I think that the MAGA wing are going to be sorely disappointed. I think already we're seeing traditional Republicans, they really didn't want Donald Trump. They used him and they used the MAGA voters to get back in power. But already, MAGA wants Rick Scott. Traditional Republicans are telling Trump to stay out of the Senate leader races because they want Cornyn or Thune or the traditional Republicans. So I think they're going to use this opportunity to kind of drop kick MAGA. I don't think they see it coming. Donald Trump is already, he's not, where is he? I mean, I think he's given a couple of speeches, but J.D. Vance and Elon and Peter Thiel and all those guys are doing what they're doing for the billionaire class. And I think MAGA is going to be in for a rude awakening when they see what happens. The Latino men that voted for Donald Trump, they're expecting something. And I know there were a few sensational videos. Well, I was a legal immigrant, but I voted for Trump because I don't want a legal immigrant. There were a few sensational videos, but at the end of the day, the Latino population are very family-oriented. And for the most part, I don't think we're going to see any mass deportations. I know people are afraid of it, but Trump is very transactional. What can you do for me? In addition to the wider Muslim community in Dearborn, I didn't realize that Trump made a deal with them for votes in Michigan in order to do something with the whole Palestine situation. So I don't think MAGA is at the top of his priority list at this point, and I think they're going to realize that in the coming months.
Nikki,
and then
you're very smart.
Yeah. So I am going to just watch this unfold without getting actively involved in any way. We've got the midterms coming up, but I'm going to stay in the fight. And then just the last quick point I wanted to make about white women. It's difficult for me to say, and this certainly isn't the majority of white women that I know or that were involved with grassroots with us up in Wisconsin for years, that were at the rallies. I mean, these are fantastic women. But I did sense with some of the women that I know are good people that I worked with, a week before the election, all of a sudden, someone would say, hey, did you see the rally? Did you go to the rally, Kamal's rally? And I see a little win. And I didn't really know what it was about and didn't address it. But I think that in some ways Hillary's loss, and then there was just some hesitation for the first woman president to be black. I think they had the same issue with Nikki Haley. And it's not necessarily coming. I know women, and we can be a little bitter sometimes. And I think that white women from some corners have been put in such a situation as, oh, they're weak or they're this. They had a derogatory Karen term. And I think, there was so much black woman. There was Michelle Obama, and there was Beyonce, and there was, Vice President Harris and Jasmine Crockett. And as we would talk about these things at work, I would see some retreat, and I think they just kind of felt left out and just didn't want to see that. So I think there were a lot of factors at play. It's unfortunate, but for some reason, I feel like come the midterms, Americans are going to realize what happened and return to their senses.
Nikki, I hope you're right. Anyway, thank you for calling. Thank you for listening. And thank you for, being part of this conversation. And thank you for Wisconsin. Okay. You know what? We lost Wisconsin, but a lot of good happened there, too. A lot of good happened.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you. Yep.
You bet. Where am I? Margaret, I think you're next. Margaret, are you there? Maybe not. Okay, Michael.
Hi, Edwin. This is a sort of a what-if question, and I haven't heard much about the role that Merrick Garland could have played that would have been better, and I want to get your feeling about it, or your thoughts on it. It seemed like he came in soon after the second impeachment attempt, or impeachment, and it seemed like it took a long, long time to put Jack Smith in position as a special prosecutor. My thinking is it was a mistake. It should have happened right away, and soon after the J6 committees.
Yeah.
And then if that had happened, this is the what if part of it. I mean, everything would have been speeded up, and Trump would have been, despite all the attempts to slow things down, he would have had a trial going on for the J6 and possibly for Mar-a-Lago. What do you think?
So I'm very frustrated. I'm very frustrated by this. The specific case of Jack Smith is a little different. Merrick Garland appointed Jack Smith only when Trump announced very early that he was a candidate for president, because he thought he was preserving the independence of the Justice Department by putting in a special counsel. Prior to that, the Justice Department had been working on this case itself. But I don't know how fast they worked on it. I don't know how talented the team was. I am enormously disappointed that Mr. Trump is not going to be held accountable, not just for the things he's been charged with, but for the crimes he's been convicted of. It's one of the most disappointing things in American criminal justice, and there's a lot to be disappointed about in American criminal justice.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
You bet.
I appreciate your callers. They're really sharp today.
Yeah, I think so too. Me. Yes. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Yeah. Hey, sure. Nick, you're next, and I think, Nick, you're going to be last. So let's make it good. No pressure.
Yeah. Are you there?
Yep.
Are you there? Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about the border. I really think that was the key issue in the last election for 3 or 4 really quick reasons. One, you go back 10 years ago, President Obama, President Bill Clinton, they used to talk how President-elect Trump talks now, saying that people have to come into the border legally. For some reason, we've abandoned that. That's number one. Number two, there's all kinds of misinformation about the border bill that Kamala Harris tried to pass. There are 7 Democrats that voted against that bill. That bill was filled with all kinds of other things in there. We should have tried to put through a second bill right away if we really cared about the border to shore it up. And to show that they didn't care at all about it, a lot of people are upset that we literally flew into the country from Haiti and from other places, tens of thousands of people. I don't know who gave them the authority to do that, but if you think about Haiti alone, 30,000 people, how many plane loads is that of folks coming in? I'm not saying they don't deserve a better life. I know people from the Philippines that have been waiting for years to come in legally. So when and one last comment was, and this is from our own government statistics, we let in 15,000 convicted murderers into the country, 15,000 convicted child molesters. Why would we at the border, if you know somebody was convicted of murder or convicted of child molestation, literally say, well, come on in?
Nick, that does not sound right to me. That does not sound right to me.
That's a government. You can look that up. That's a government.
I'm going to. I believe I will look it up. I will, and I'll try and find the sources because we have laws about that. And but to the extent that there were any abuses in our system, they come from it being understaffed, not having the right equipment, having no judges available to make these determinations, right? I mean, and all of this is stuff that bill may have other things in it, fixes. There will be the judges. When somebody says, I'm here from asylum, they're going to kill me if I turn around. We can figure that out, make the case, and if they meet the legal requirement, they stay. If they don't, they go. And that's where we should be. And I think we're going to get there. I mean, the parties are now in agreement on this. So I'm pretty sure we get there pretty quickly. Anyway, that's got to be our last word. Thank you all for your time.